Well, hey, everybody. Good morning to you. Happy Sunday to you. I'm really glad that you're here today because we're going to look at one of the better stories in the Bible. We're in this series throughout the summer months called Hello, My Name Is, where we're looking at some specific folks from the Bible. We're looking at them to see what we can learn about our own life by looking at their life and experience. And we're seeing what they have to teach us about faith and God and this grand story we find ourselves in. And we looked at several men in this series, Caleb and Jephthah, Gideon, Samson. But today, we're going to look at the incredible story of a woman named Ruth. Now, the 8th book of the Bible tells us the story of Ruth. It's called Ruth. That's right. And it's one of the shorter books in the Bible. It's only 4 chapters long, and it's one of the more gracious moments in the Bible, because the 8th book of the Bible, the book of Ruth, is sandwiched in between these historical books of Joshua and Judges on the front end, and then 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, after it. And those books are all filled with stories of war and the threat of war and no small amount of, unfaithfulness and disobedience and confusion and hate. And right in the middle of that, we find this grace note through the story of Ruth, where people generally act kindly toward one another and selflessly toward one another. And the ending is better than we could imagine, for sure. And in fact, the fact that it's set in the bloody and violent era of the Judges, Ruth has been called by some scholars an island of tranquility. And that seems appropriate. If you have a Bible in one way, shape, or form, get to the book of Ruth, again, the 8th book of the Bible. It's a little grace note about a few people who get some things right. The very first verse of the first chapter of Ruth says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." All right? So there's this guy named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and they're Israelites, and they're living in Bethlehem. But Bethlehem's going through a drought. The rains have failed, and so there's no harvest, and thus there's no food. And in a move of desperation, they decide to take their 2 sons and go to another place, another land, a place called Moab. And even though the Moabites and the Israelites hate each other, they despise each other, they've heard there's food in Moab. And so the possibilities of survival, it's better there. And so they figured they might not accept us. They might mistreat us. They might ostracize us. They might even kill us. But we'll give it a shot because it's better than just sitting around here waiting to starve to death in Bethlehem. And so they go. Now, imagine for a moment being a foreigner in a strange land that's not your own. Like strange customs, strange culture, strange places, strange values, strange things. Understand that Moab is not that far off physically, like it's only about 30 miles away, but it was far off in just about every other way possible. Now, I don't know how many of you have left the place where you've grown up or where your family came from, but that can be tough sometimes to relocate to a whole other place. On a much, much smaller scale than many of you have experienced, and on a much, much, much smaller scale than we're talking about here in the book of Ruth. But in my early 20s, I moved from the place that I grew up, the great southern state of Tennessee, to this here great mid-Atlantic state of Maryland in my early 20s. Now, Maryland was not in any way hostile to me when I moved here in the early 90s. On the contrary, I was warmly received. I became a part of a church family that kindly and lovingly embraced me and cared about me. And I quickly assimilated to all things Maryland. For example, I instantly became a Baltimore Orioles fan. No kidding. Like the very first Major League Baseball game I ever saw in person was at the old Memorial Stadium when Big Ben McDonald took the hill against those hated New York Yankees. And I was there in the next to last row in the upper deck at Memorial Stadium booing the evil pinstripe empire, along with everybody else. I assimilated. And then I quickly discovered where everybody ran off to during the summer months, down the shore, hon. that sort of thing. And it wasn't long before I found myself walking on the boardwalk in Ocean City, eating Fisher's popcorn and Thrasher's fries. I assimilated. Still, though, there were some very strange things about this foreign land that I now called home. For instance, what kind of absolute oddity is it that no one here can seem to figure out how to put any sugar in iced tea when they're making it? So it's hot and the sugar dissolves and becomes part of it. Like, how silly, how foolish, how stupid is that, right? Like, I'd ask for sweet tea at a restaurant and the server would say something like, oh, we don't have sweet tea, but we do have unsweet tea, and there's some sweetener there on the table. And it's like, what? Like, get behind me, Satan. What manner of evil is this? I would just as soon stick my head in the Mississippi and swallow than do that. There was one place, though, that did understand me, all right? One spring in the desert of a barren land that flowed from the throne of God in that day. One place, Chick-fil-A. Now, in those days, it seemed like there was one Chick-fil-A in the entire region. It was over here at White Marsh Mall, right? One Chick-fil-A in the White Marsh Mall. And they got me. And they knew how to make sweet tea. So I survived in those early days. Stranger still was that most celebrated of all Maryland foods. Yeah, Maryland blue crabs, smothered in Old Bay. And really all things Maryland crab, really, like crab cakes and crab dip and cream of crab soup and Maryland crab soup and crab roll, crab chips, crab. Just put it on everything, right? And I got into this too, a little bit. I wasn't very good at, cracking crabs, not very efficient at all at it, but I gave it a whirl often enough. And I got so excited about this when my family was coming into town, visiting from down south. My mom and dad, my two older brothers, they were coming into town. And I decided I'm going to treat them to a crab feast, just like all the Marylanders do. And so I went and I got a bunch of crabs dripping with Old Bay, and I covered the table with brown paper like you do, We got the mallets and everything out there. And we sit down, and I get a batch of crabs, and I just dump them out there right on the table, these little lifeless creatures smothered in what looks like dirt, And I start to put my family through Maryland Blue Crab 101, And it's important to remember that seafood where I came from, down south, East Tennessee, was our idea of seafood was a night out at Captain D's, like deep fry everything. That's our idea. But here we go, making the jump to the big leagues. And right off the bat, my mom cuts her finger, like right out the gate. Yeah, and she tried to play it off, but we get, it kind of burns a little bit. And I hadn't thought too much about this beforehand either. But my oldest brother, Tim, he was actually a vegetarian at the time. So he's practically protesting our dinner, while we're there. And my other brother, Jamie's a big guy, real big guy. And I hadn't really thought through this, but I didn't get anything else for us to eat, just the crabs. So Jamie's like, is there anything else? Because this seems like a whole lot of work for a little bit of food. And he's not wrong. He's not wrong. But I didn't provide anything else. No burgers or corn or salad or fruit, not even a crab cake or anything like that. Just a couple dozen lifeless creatures on a picnic table covered with brown paper in the scorching August Maryland sun. It played out a lot differently in my head. But needless to say, my family thought this was very, very strange. And if you've ever left the place you grew up and settled some other place, there are all these differences. Distinctives about that place that can seem strange. But listen, these are small, friendly distinctives between two states of the same country. But the differences between Bethlehem and Moab, between the Israelites and Moabites, it tended to be hostile and threatening. They had a lot of history that wasn't pleasant between each other. In fact, Moabites were considered by the Israelites to be so unclean that earlier in the Bible, in the law of Deuteronomy, it said, no Moabite or any of his descendants may enter your assembly, may be a part of your community, even down to the 10th generation. But Naomi and her husband Elimelech, they're desperate. And so they pack up their two young sons and this hungry family and make their way to Moab. Now, we don't know, but it's safe to assume that they were received much more kindly than they had expected. And they begin to assimilate to the Moabite culture. Elimelech finds sufficient work there. In time, their poverty lightens up. Their young sons grow up there in the community. And they eventually, both sons, they marry Moabite women. They settle in. And just when it seemed like all that struggle and hardship was in their distant past, Elimelech dies. The father dies. Naomi's husband dies. And not too long after that, both Naomi's sons die. Her husband died. Her sons died. She's a widow. She's devastated. She ends up not just as a widow, but childless too. And so she makes a decision at that point. She decides to return to Israel, to Bethlehem. But remember, her two daughter-in-laws were from Moab. You remember, they're Moabites. And so she says to them, hey, you stay here with your own people, start over, find a new husband, remarry, start a family here, just start your life over again. And one of them does. Orpah is her name. Orpah stays. But the other one, whose name is Ruth, says, no, I'm going to stay with you, Naomi. She's not leaving her mother-in-law. And here's how she expresses it. If you look at verse 16 here, this is a great verse in the Bible. And if you've been to enough weddings before, you've probably heard a portion of this verse because it seems to be frequent on the wedding circuit. But verse 16, in response to Naomi urging her to stay in Moab and start over, Ruth says this, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Now, this is an incredibly heroic thing. And I don't know if at first glance we fully get this. Because what's happening here is Ruth, she's breaking with her country. She's breaking with her culture. She's breaking with her family. She's breaking with her faith. And she's not going to search for a new husband. She's not going to start over with a new family. She's going to stay with Naomi. Like one writer puts it like this, in a world where life depended on men, she committed herself to an old woman. There's no more radical decision. See, one of the things for us to make sure and grab onto is the redemptive role that Ruth plays for Naomi. Naomi's old. Naomi's a widow. She has no sons. Sons were everything in that ancient world. She looks like she's got no future. She's surely going back to where she came from to die. But Ruth won't let her go alone. Ruth won't leave her to face the harsh world alone. Ruth leaves her home. Ruth leaves her own people. Ruth leaves her own culture to stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And because of this choice, well, Ruth redeems Naomi's life. That's what we'll come to see here in just a minute. And redemption is one of the key concepts in the book of Ruth. The word redemption in its different forms shows up 23 times in these 4 short chapters. Ruth redeems Naomi's future because she sacrifices her own future. Ruth becomes an outsider in Bethlehem, where she's not from. Ruth becomes the outcast, the alien, the foreigner, by committing herself to Naomi. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Where you die, I'll die. I'm not going to leave you. This is one of the finest illustrations of sacrificial love and commitment and friendship as there is anywhere. And it's from one young widow to another old widow. It's beautiful. And let me just say, as like a sidebar for just a second, all of us are meant to experience that sort of connection and friendship. We're meant to journey with people all throughout our life. It's part of why the church exists. And if you're coming here, I'm glad you're coming here, but if you're coming here and just kind of on the periphery, kind of slip in, slip out, and you're anonymous, I'm glad you're here, but eventually, if you don't have some relationships that hint, a little bit of a reflection of what we're seeing here between Ruth and Naomi, where you're just missing out on one of the best parts of the church. You're missing out on one of the best parts of life. Ruth, she's a redeemer, a little mini redeemer, a micro redeemer, a kind of hidden redeemer in the book of Ruth. But she's not the only one. There's another redeemer. Because they go back to Bethlehem where Naomi is from, and Naomi's been gone a long time now. It seems like a lifetime ago. But some folks, they recognize Naomi. They say, hey, aren't you Naomi? And Naomi says, don't call me Naomi. Naomi means pleasant. She says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Mara means bitter. She says, call me Mara because my life is bitter. It's empty. In a male-dominated patriarchal world, she's lost her husband. She's lost her sons. Her future's bleak. She's too old to remarry. She's too old to have more kids. She's even too old to work. Like, how are they going to make it? Well, Ruth is still young, and Ruth is able to work. And so Ruth goes out to find some work. And she goes out to do what's called gleaning in a field. Now, it's important for us to understand about this, gleaning. Because one of the laws for an Israelite farmer is that they would practice sloppy farming. They would leave a little stuff on the edges of the field for the poor to come along, to glean that, you see. God had instructed them not to harvest all the way to the edges. They weren't allowed to maximize profits in that way. You know, it was a gracious way to go and provide something for the poor. The poor would come behind them, and so they'd have something to eat too. And this could be a little dangerous for the poor. It's a dog-eat-dog world. It would be especially dangerous for a woman, and even more dangerous for a foreign woman from Moab, a hated, despised people. You'll even notice from this point on, if you read through the book of Ruth, Ruth is referred to as Ruth the Moabitess from here on out in the book. It's being pointed out to us intentionally. So Ruth goes out to glean from the edges of a field in hopes of getting something to eat for she and Naomi, and she happens to go that day to the field of a man named Boaz. And Boaz, well, he notices her, and he asks around about her, and he finds out about her story. And he does some things for her that go way beyond what the law required and what duty required. He shows an enormous amount of compassion, kindness, generosity to Ruth. He doesn't have to, but he does. And he goes to Ruth and he says, hey, listen, Ruth, you don't have to go to another field tomorrow. Like, you can come right back here to this field. Keep coming to my field. You can keep gleaning right here. My men, they won't hurt you. I'll protect you. And this was a big deal. He even invites her to drink some of their water supply, which is a real precious thing. He invites her to share in their meal. And he pulls his workers aside and he says, hey, not only don't hassle this woman, but I want you to cut some stalks off the grain and just lay them on the ground, behind you like it happened by accident, so that Ruth can come along and pick them up when she goes by. And that's what happens. And of course, Ruth is very, very moved by all these gestures of generosity and kindness. And she says there in verse 10 of chapter 2, she says, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Like, Ruth knows how unusual this is, how incredibly generous and compassionate this is. And part of what we see here in the example of Boaz is how all of us are to be. See, God's people are to have a heart for those who are far from the family of God. Boaz is a picture of what the church ought to be, about what a follower of Jesus ought to be, about what a Christian ought to be. Generous, kind, compassionate, reaching across different separating lines. Would you say that's who you are? Like Boaz? Well, at the end of the day, Ruth goes back to Naomi, and her arms are full. Like, she's got way more, than just a day of gleaning here. She's loaded up. And she tells Naomi about all this. Ruth says, a man has given me food. He's shown me kindness. And Naomi is very excited too. Naomi says, well, bless this man. Who is this man? Who did this for you? And Ruth tells her it was a guy named Boaz. And Naomi says, are you kidding me? Boaz, do you know, Ruth, do you know who Boaz is? And of course, Ruth doesn't know who Boaz is. She just went to a random field that day. Naomi says, Boaz happens to be one of our kinsman redeemers. Are you excited about this? No, you're not excited about this because you don't have a clue what this means. But we need to understand this, all right? It's very, very important. Let's talk about this idea of a kinsman redeemer. And this is sort of the second redeemer we see in the book of Ruth, a kinsman redeemer, sort of a formal, official redeemer. Remember, Ruth to Naomi was sort of a hidden mini redeemer. Here's sort of an official redeemer, because in Jewish law and Levitical law, in the book of Leviticus in the Bible, in the 25th chapter, there's an interesting law that God had given to his people in case somebody had gotten into debt, gotten themselves into trouble, and ended up having to sell their land. Land was precious. And if they got into some sort of debt of some sort, had to sell their land, God made a couple of provisions to get it back. One was that the land could be bought back by what was called a kinsman redeemer. It could be ransomed out of debt by the closest kinsman, by a member of the family. And it was a way of keeping families together, and it was essentially a gracious law given by God for families. And Naomi realizes that Boaz is a distant relative who could help with that. Now, it would cost him a lot, an enormous amount to pay the debt for the land. And in doing so, Boaz would also have to marry Naomi in order to bring about heirs to pass the land on to in the future. Otherwise, why, buy back the land? But Naomi, remember, she's no woman. She can't bring about any heirs, which means Boaz would have to marry Ruth, who's still a young woman. But Ruth is a Moabite, remember? And this could bring a whole lot of backlash in a lot of different ways. And if he did marry Ruth, not only would he take on the debt and marry a foreigner, but all of his wealth would become Ruth's and Naomi's. Like legally, immediately, automatically, completely. They'd have this whole new inheritance that they didn't work for or earn. This whole new wealth, which they weren't around for the accumulation of. They would have this whole new life transferred straight to them. Boaz would be willingly surrendering everything he's worked for in his life to them, along with paying off the debt for the land. And he does. It's sort of the hinge of the whole story. Check it out. Chapter 3, Naomi says to Ruth in chapter 3, Ruth comes home and says, hey, Boaz was great to me. She's like, oh, Boaz, goodness, he's a kinsman redeemer. So she says in verse 3 of chapter 3, tonight Boaz is going to be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Like she's giving Ruth a little dating advice here. And probably she's getting to the fact that Ruth needs to put aside the symbols of mourning and widowhood, the symbolic garments that go with that. And Naomi figures Boaz might have a little more than just evangelistic interests in Ruth. So, she says, wash up, Ruth, get perfumed, put on a nice dress, and go. He's going to be sleeping where he's working tonight, so go and uncover his feet, because I think I know what he'll do next if you uncover his feet. That's what verse 4 says. When he lies down, note the place where he's lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. Now, we would all like to know, everybody who reads Ruth wants to know, what's the significance of uncovering his feet? Like, what's the feet thing about, Dave? Tell me about the feet, all right? What's that all about? And I'm going to tell you, all right? I don't know. And nobody really knows. Nobody. Unfortunately, there's nothing in ancient history that tells us about the practice of uncovering someone's feet. But apparently, in that culture, it was a way to let a man know that you're interested in him. And probably, guys, if a woman came up to you and uncovered your feet, like if a lady at the end of the service here unlaced your sneakers and slipped your Jordans off, it would get your attention, would it not? Yeah. Well, that's what Ruth does. She goes over to where Boaz is snoozing. She uncovers his feet. Eventually, he wakes up, and Boaz is surprised, and he asks what's going on. And Ruth says to him, verse 9, she says, spread a corner of your garment over me. Now, garments were often symbolic, all right? Think about Joseph's multicolored coat. We talked about that back in June, if you were here. There's a lot of symbolism in this whole garment thing. And the idea here is let me come under your protection and care. Ruth is more or less proposing. And she's appealing to Boaz's kinsman obligation to provide for she and Naomi. And you know what Boaz says? You know what he does? He says, yabba dabba doo. He says, all right. And there's this whole formal process where he ends up going outside the city gates, and he gets the elders together outside the city gates, and he negotiates outside the city gates to pay the debt for the land. And he does it. And Ruth and they become married. They have a child. Naomi becomes a grandmother and has a family again. She becomes like a second mother for the child, and her joy is restored. She's no longer, Mara now, bitter. She's not bitter. She's Naomi again. And she becomes a grandmother. Now, those of you who have become grandparents, it's hard to contain, your excitement. I'm not a grandparent, but you all rave about it. And I watch people and hear people talk about being grandparents, and they go on and on about their grandkids. I remember hearing Tony Campolo. He said one time, grandchildren are God's gift to you for not killing your children, right? And that seems true. But you magnify that 1,000 times in the ancient world. Like family was everything. Children were everything. And Naomi, she has a child. She's a grandmother. Verse 14 of chapter 4, the women say to Naomi, praise be to the Lord who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, catch this verse, for your daughter-in-law who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth. Now, this is a huge statement here. In traditional culture, sons were everything. And saying 7 sons is a way of talking about the perfect family. 7 was considered the perfect number, the complete number. And they say, your daughter-in-law is better than all of that. Your Moabite daughter-in-law, she's better than all of that. And Naomi's joy is restored, and her life is sustained. Through the sacrificial commitment of her daughter-in-law, Ruth, Naomi's life is restored. And through the incredibly gracious and generous kinsman redeemer Boaz, Naomi's life is restored. It's a beautiful, beautiful story of redemption. And we could stop there. And a lot of people are tempted to stop there. But see, then we'd miss really not just the hinge of this story, but what should be the hinge of our life. Because ultimately, it all points to the great kinsman redeemer, the ultimate redeemer. Did you catch that? Those of you who maybe have read to the end of Ruth? See, there's a final detail in the book of Ruth, and it's sort of the punchline of the whole book. And it needs to be the punchline of our life. Check out Ruth 4:16. Then Naomi took the child, laid him in her lap, and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And the book of Ruth ends with this genealogy, which is so very significant. This should be screaming at us. See, it's a real small book, just 4 chapters with real ordinary people, a bunch of quiet acts of servanthood, generosity, compassion. But behind the scenes, there's this bigger story that's going on. The sovereign God of the universe is at work in ways that these obscure people have no idea about. And it turns out that Ruth, a Gentile, a Moabite, is going to be the great-grandmother of David, who became the greatest king of ancient Israel. And, of course, those of you who know in the New Testament, if you open up to the very first page of the New Testament, guess what you see there? A genealogy. And it tells us who is a descendant of David, who is a son of David. Yeah, I know we're in church. And it seems like the right answer should be Jesus, but it is. It's Jesus. Jesus, the very Son of God, the Messiah King himself, is not a pure-blooded Israelite. This is a remarkable way that the Bible shows very early on that God's primary concern is never simply one ethnic group. His desire is and always has been that all the peoples of the earth should be his people, even the Moabites. Because the story of Ruth all leads to and points to the real Redeemer, the ultimate Redeemer, the child born in Bethlehem. Not Obed, not Jesse, not David, but the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild of David, Jesus, who looks a whole lot like his ancient father and mother, Boaz and Ruth, doesn't he? Because like Ruth, Jesus left his home above. He threw his life away for our sake. Jesus Christ looked at us and said, not even death will part me from you. I will die so that we don't have to be apart. He's the greatest friend, greater than Ruth. And like Boaz, Jesus becomes your kinsman redeemer, my kinsman redeemer, becoming our substitute, taking our place, paying our price, being our mediator. And like Boaz, Jesus not only paid your debt, but he reaches out and willingly, he reaches out for you and transfers all his wealth, his treasure, his righteousness. It all becomes yours. He left his Father's throne above, the great Wesley hymn says. So free, so infinite his grace. No condemnation now I dread. Jesus and all in him is mine. Alive in him, my living head, and clothed in righteousness divine. Bold, I approach the eternal throne. And Christ, the crown, he is my own. CCC, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how marginal you are or what a failure it seems like your story has become. The message of Ruth is a message of grace. The message of Ruth is not, if you just trust God, he'll give you what you want. That's what we always think. We get so mixed up about all this. We think this is what it's all about. I'm towing the line, God, just like Ruth did. Like she went back. She went back to Bethlehem. She held on to her faith, and it worked out for her, so it's going to work out for me too. I'm towing the line, God. I'm showing up here. You got to come through for me. You got to work it out for me. No, that's not the message of Ruth. That's not the message of the Bible. And becoming a Christian isn't primarily about saying, well, let me be like Ruth. Let me be a friend like Ruth. Let me reach across divides like Boaz. No. A Christian sees and really understands that there is a true Redeemer, a kinsman Redeemer, the true kinsman Redeemer. And through grace, he has covered you with his garment, and all of his spiritual wealth is yours. He threw his life away so that you and I could have one. And because of him, in the sight of the Father, you and I, we are absolutely loved and prized and accepted now. That's the story. That's the hinge. And it needs to be the hinge of our life. This is what makes sense of everything else in your life, you see. It's the only story that fulfills. It's the only story that satisfies us. It's the only story we make sense of it all. No condemnation now I dread. Jesus and all in him is mine. Alive in him, my living head, and clothed in righteousness divine. Bold, I approach the eternal throne and claim the crown through Christ my own. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, should die for me? Let's pray together. Father, indeed, your love for us is, it's priceless. It's life-changing. It's incredible. It's overwhelming. Would you overwhelm us again? Thank you for this story here that we have in Ruth that really points us to something deeper, better, bigger. I pray we would be consumed by it, by your love, by what you've done for us, by your death, burial, and resurrection. We invite you. We invite that. We invite Jesus Christ to be the hinge of our life. It's in his wonderful name we pray. Amen. Let's take a few moments. Let's take a few moments and let's celebrate communion. We do this every week. It commemorates this very thing we're talking about here today, our kinsman redeemer. In the back, there are these little individually wrapped packets, have a little piece of bread and a little bit of juice. It reminds us of Jesus' body and blood given up for us on the cross. And that leads to the resurrection. Let's take a few moments right now and celebrate communion.
The rest of the weekend. Take care, everybody. See you next time.